the National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thanks, Mike. People today have come to accept the notion that rights are the same as needs, but this concept is foreign to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and a free society. In today's program, we'll look back at the Founding Fathers and try to figure out what's changed.
Our program, as usual, consists of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and an in-depth analysis of the entire subject by our panel of experts. We'll begin our probe report, Rights and Wrongs, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
No statement about human rights has ever been more eloquent than the one penned by Thomas Jefferson in 1776. Perhaps we have become so used to his exquisite language that we have not thought to consider the details of his logic. There are 4 key points. First, everyone has exactly the same rights. All are created equal. Second, the source of rights lies in a creator. Aware that religious views vary, Jefferson associated this creator with nature or nature's God. Even an atheist must concede that we are here and thus created by some process. Whether you view that process as natural or divine, it is the source of your rights. And since rights are a product of creation itself, they are inherent, permanent, inalienable. Third, Jefferson, drawing on earlier philosophers, summarized these inalienable rights with the ringing phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Note that it is only the pursuit of happiness that is a right. Of happiness itself, there can be no guarantee. Fourth, Jefferson spoke of the role of government in the process. Its role, he said, was to protect rights, or in his words, to secure them. Should a government become destructive to the rights of the people could legitimately rise and overthrow it. 15 years later, the new nation adopted a document called the Bill of Rights, spelling out in more detail the meaning of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The right to the free exercise of religion, of speech, the press, peaceable assembly, and petition of the government. The right to keep and bear arms. The right to the security of one's person, home, papers, and effects, and against unreasonable searches and seizures. The right to a fair trial, speedy and public, governed by due process, and decided by an impartial jury, whose decisions may not result in excessive fines or cruel or unusual punishments.
When the founders said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, what they were doing was placing themselves in the grand tradition of natural law and natural rights. That is to say, the truths they were about to set forth were truths of reason. These were not mere policies or value judgments. These were truths of reason, true for all men at all times, in all circumstances.
The rights people actually have under nature, and as recognized in the Declaration of Independence, don't require affirmative or overt action on the part of other human beings. All that your rights require of other human beings is that they let you alone, or that they honor their contracts with you. A right to a meal or to a job or to a minimum, minimum annual income is a kind of a newfangled right.
There's all the difference in the world between saying it would be good to have medical care, to have health care, to have housing, to have education, and on and on and on, and saying that those are rights.
The reason you don't have a right to a meal or to a job is because implicit within that, if you did have it, that would mean you would have a right to command the performance of some favor to you by some other human being.
But is not human compassion alone sufficient cause to justify government action to aid the downtrodden, even if that means forcing the more prosperous to finance such action against their will?
You've had this new kind of right emerge largely with reference to the poor versus the rich. But that is not the way it is worked out in practice in large measure. I would be the first to say that there is some level of the welfare state that can be justified, not from considerations of rights, but from considerations of what it is to live in a decent society. The way this has worked out in practice, however, is that special interests have gone to the legislatures, have worked the democratic process to get massive redistribution, not from rich to poor, but from the general population to the special interests. Why should I be taxed to subsidize a tobacco industry? But is it any different with the National Endowment for the Arts? Is it any different with subsidies that are given to the sugar industry? Is it any different with subsidies that are given to the public broadcasting system or any other government scheme of that kind that you want to point to?
The great problem for anyone who's trying to design a government is to design a government so that it will secure the rights without violating rights in the process. You don't want the government in the process of protecting you from some individual who comes along like a thief in the night to itself become a thief in the night in the form of the tax collector or the regulator or whatever.
I hope if we've learned anything from the experience of the 20th century, it is that not only is this way of doing things a monumental failure economically, but it is a monumental failure morally. What better evidence do we need of that than the Berlin Wall, which was a statement about how people do not want to live under a regime like this. They will flee, they will vote with their feet to escape a regime like this. In the end, people really don't want the goods and services provided by the state. They want to provide them for themselves. Rights ultimately then are rights to liberty, not rights to the goods and services of this world.
Remember when life was simpler and problems were solvable? When you could rely on good common sense and your own honesty and initiative to see you through? That was back before government regulation got so tangled up in our public and private lives, before paperwork and arbitrary rules took over and individual choice was locked out. The National Endowment for Liberty believes that most of our problems cannot be solved by government, that too much government is in itself a problem, not a solution. These programs are made possible as a public service by people who believe that moral and political rights go hand in hand with economic freedom. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Liberty can set you free.
Liberty is the most important thing. We're not guaranteeing you a meal, but you are a free person. You can pursue what you want to pursue. And I like that idea.
Each week on At Issue, we show the probe report you've just seen to a group of citizens somewhere in the United States. What you're watching are the unrehearsed reactions of people in Bloomington, Minnesota to the probe report, Rights and Wrongs.
A lot of these programs are running out of money, and something has to be done.
Those are rights that the government cannot take away from me. Those are mine. They're mine to do with it. They belong to the citizens. What it means to me is that basically I have something to hang my hat on. In other words, if I have a grievance, I have a method or something to have these grievances addressed.
We have them, and so does everyone else. We can't infringe on someone else's, like some of them, the right to bear arms. We have that right.
Like when I worked at a grocery store here, we had women trying to buy cigarettes with food stamps, trying to buy goods that weren't meant for what they're meant to be. You and I paid for that food stamp, and they're trying to do these things. That we need more tighter regulation. Make them work for them food stamps.
They start the program, and if they do try to stop it, they meet with resistance. And I don't think it's necessarily from the majority. It's from special interest groups.
They're designed to meet a need, and then they take a life on them, take a life of their own. Get a life of their own, I should say, and just perpetuate themselves with no end. The initial thought is good, but
The road always paved with good intentions, they say.
If the American people really knew how much of our money is being thrown down a rat hole and just wasted, I mean, they just wouldn't believe it. It's a trend towards socialism. Socialistic. I mean, where the government does everything for you. You don't have to even think, Because I think our country is swinging towards socialism. But all the time it's getting further and further to the socialist attitude.
I think they did originally originate with the Bill of Rights, and I think it has to do with life and what kind of a life are you going to lead. But, I mean, I don't think our forefathers could foresee what our country would become, but then somewhere along the line it's gotten blown all out of proportion.
a right is to be, you have a right to be right, and you also have the right to be wrong.
The Bill of Rights did not include a benevolent government. It just said that you have the privilege of doing your own thing, of pursuing happiness, of freedom of speech, and so forth, and it doesn't guarantee you any of the goods whatsoever.
Well, I think they got the point. Let's meet our panel of experts and see what they have to add. Tom Bethel is the Washington editor of the American Spectator. And Fred Smith is the president of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a Washington, D.C. think tank. And our host and permanent panelist is chairman of the National Endowment for Liberty, Ron Paul. Ron, what are some of the consequences of this confusion over the nature of rights?
Mike, I think there's a lot of consequences, and I think the many problems this country faces today is a result of the fact that we have lost the precise definition of what rights means. And I think it's happened sometime in this century, and I think it's critical. So often I believe that in Congress and other places they deal with everything in a technical way. They think that there's a problem here, how do we deal with it, rather than in a strategic way of what basically and fundamentally is flawed. We might talk about a food stamp program and decide that there's inefficiencies in it, doesn't work very well, but I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is are these programs legitimate? Are they moral? Then, of course, are they efficient and do they work? But basically, are these programs legitimate and moral? The question I want to pose to the two of you first off is, when do you think these attitudes changed? I doubt very much if our founders in this country had any idea what would happen. And so often we hear our judges recite and say, well, we can't go by what original intent of the Constitution was. What we have to do is interpret these laws and do things according to the needs of the people today. Then they do just about anything they please. But when do you think this happened, and why do you think it happened? Fred or Tom, go ahead.
Well, I would say maybe it happened with the New Deal, in the 1930s, let's say, where income redistribution really, it seems to me, began about that time. I don't know, Fred, was there much income redistribution before then? But it seemed.
A little bit. Bob Higgs argues that in a sense it was every time there's a crisis, the Civil War, the American Civil War provided an ample opportunity to do good through political means, and then the progressive movement at the turn of the century where the early Republicans ran out and did all kinds of interesting things to protect forests, for example. People were too stupid to plant trees, only government would collect the trees. And then in the 30s we had this vast expansion into all kinds of poverty-related issues and income-related.
Right.
And then now it's everything, environment, housing, everything.
Yeah, you know, I think that it became very popular, certainly in the 30s, but probably the seeds were sown before that, because the interpretation so often by so many economists and many individuals in this country, and especially politicians, was that the crisis of the 30s was a consequence of capitalism and that horrible gold standard, rather than making the correct economic assumption that we had a lot of problems in the 1930s, not because we had too much capitalism, but because we already had too much government. But certainly in the welfare sense, I think these ideas came in the 1930s and they have blossomed. But what's the answer to the argument that, you know, people's standard of living hasn't precipitously dropped in these last 50 years? I mean, there are some, certainly, I think you could argue it has hurt, but the overall wealth in the country has held up fairly well in these past 50 years.
You could certainly make the argument that the parts, the inner cities where these income, to which the income has been redistributed, have in fact been hurt relatively, and that they would be much better off right now if they'd never had these welfare programs in the first place.
And you could generally argue that in a sense, the myth that collective political action is a better way to enhance human welfare rather than individual action in a system of individual rights, property rights and so on, is a better way of handling it. Starts off really in the turn of the century when Bismarck starts in Germany, the first modern leader of a modern state. We sort of, the intellectuals saw this new state being born. The intellectuals were dominating the system. They ran with that idea. But then it became possible to believe that we could all get rich by picking each other's pockets. And clearly some people found it very advantageous to make those cases. And so we rushed out to start protecting them. There's a lot of ruin, though, in a great country. And where politics has been the longest in our country, the Postal Service, the national forests and national parks, that was almost 100 years now, and now increasingly our whole welfare establishment, the rot is set in. The parts of our economy that are most vigorous are those that are still most in the free market system.
You know, I think these are some of the bad effects of a misunderstanding of what rights are, but so often we hear the cliches used routinely in the media and in the Congress about rights of groups. They'll talk about, say, women's rights or children's rights or gay rights or minority rights and on and on and on, or rights to education. Has this word really been totally destroyed in the conventional literature?
I think that is the problem, is that the meaning of the word rights has been completely lost. I mean, the original idea from the framers was the idea that a right is a limitation of government power. It is something that government cannot do. It specifies things that powers that government does not have. And so in a way there's a confusion in the Constitution, I think, and the Constitution spells out things that government can do, the powers that government has, and then they tacked onto it an addendum, a list of things that, and by the way, these are things that government cannot do.
Negative rights.
Which is, in a sense, slightly illogical. Because if you specify that just the things that government can do, and that's all it can do, you don't need then to add on a list and saying, by the way, you can't do these things, because you never gave them power to do that in the
You
first
don't think
place.
our 9th and 10th Amendment gives us enough protection there? Because in a way, they, I think, thought about that.
Well, I think that you could argue that we would have been better off without a Bill of Rights at all, because essentially adding on rights creates the suspicion that the powers that are given to the government in the body of the Constitution don't really mean exactly what they say.
You know, I tend to think that they don't really care what's written in the Constitution, and even when it is spelled out clearly, sometimes they tend to want to ignore it anyway.
Right.
That idea of essentially trying to leave open-ended what government is to do, which is certainly the current philosophy. Government can do anything that a transient majority thinks okay, and there really are no restrictions. Americans still, I think, believe government shouldn't do certain things, but I don't think they're fully aware of how far their congressional, legislative, and judicial leaders have moved away from that
Well,
system.
I think the conventional wisdom has been that the general welfare concept in the Constitution means that we're supposed to take care of everybody, and they think it's in the Constitution. Most people today believe it's in the Constitution, that we're supposed to be a welfare socialist society.
But most people, I think, know full well that government can't do anything for us unless it first takes it away from us. I think most Americans are.
Hold that thought for just a moment. We're going to have to take a quick break. We'll be right back. Return to more views and comments on the subject at issue in just a moment.
Throughout this series of programs, you will see ideas examined that affect every part of your life. We'll look at issues from a new angle, not from the left or the right, but from the perspective of individual liberty and responsibility. We believe our founding fathers were right. We are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these is the right to life, liberty, and property. We do not accept your money transferred through state or federal government agencies. Instead, this series is funded by direct voluntary gifts from individuals. We are the National Endowment for Liberty. Call us right now, 1-800-333-3545, extension 909. For a transcript of this program, specify the subject and send $5 in a stamped self-addressed envelope to P.O. Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058. The National Endowment for Liberty, providing information on America's most precious resource, individual freedom.
Ron, when we broke, Fred was mentioning that you can't give something to somebody without taking something from somebody else.
That's right, and I'd like to follow up on that and let you expand on that, because I think in a way this may be the core of the problem, because we fail to ignore the other half of the equation. A lot of people are for helping people, and they think, boy, if government can only help them out, but they never fully contemplate and understand that to give somebody a house, you have to steal a house from somebody. Somebody had to produce it, somebody had to get the wealth, so therefore the whole concept is based on immorality. We're not allowed to go out and steal what we want, so why is it that government is going out there and doing the stealing for them?
And in fact, that very concept of the morality of a society, we know that religious values require that an individual does good because they elect to do good. If they're coerced into doing good, I mean, that would violate the whole concept of free will. God made it possible for us to reject the good, and in that way only can we be good. I think what government tries to do, coercive utopians try to do, is to make us be moral by forcing us to be kind in their terms to others, but of course in so doing, as you say, are taking resources away from others. It's a contradiction, and it's a popular contradiction.
Right, and there's an underlying presumption there. If you say, well, we're going to have to coerce people into doing this, is that you're presuming kind of bad human nature or something, that if you just let people use their own free will, they will not do the right thing, and therefore you have to use force on them. And in the socialist countries where this has been tried, you know, I'm thinking of countries like Cuba, where they have a completely false notion of rights, and which really mean obligations on the government, then they don't have any material, even anything, a fraction of the material prosperity that we have.
But you know, it's interesting, there are some people who recognize that you can't make people better by coercion, but they want to make the economy better by coercion. And others conversely say, well, you can't make the economy better, so it should be totally free, but we're going to make people better, and they want to coerce individuals in their private habits.
Yeah, and if you look at as the growth of rights in this broad, non-righteous sense has come out, people have been encouraged to be less moral themselves, because after all, if you give at the office, you don't give at home, and more Americans think they've given coercively in their paychecks, their tax payments, and so they feel that, well, I've already been taken once, I can't be taken again. So we've actually made the world a less moral place by our attempts to be a moral politic.
And you know, the argument that maybe this is good because it's going to help people really doesn't pan out, because I think the evidence is very clear, not only in Eastern Europe, but here in the United States, that the system really doesn't work. Not only is this system of redistribution based on an immoral principle, but it's not a very good system. It doesn't work that well.
It doesn't, in fact, work. You know, one of the things I was thinking in the earlier part of the program, one of the things that may be a problem, I've often thought this, is that Jefferson used the phrase pursuit of happiness, which is really is vague and does kind of give a blank check to Congress, as you suggested. I mean, the original phrase of John Locke was life, liberty, and property. And I think that if we were concentrating more on property rights, and that the government really doesn't have a right to take away your property, including your income. This is the problem. Is so much of our income is taken away, and the government does have a right, I suppose, to collect some revenue to operate the basic sort of structure of minimum lighthouse and defense, maybe, or something like that. But then this has gotten blurred with the additional income that they're taking from you to give to other people, which I think is not legitimate.
Gentlemen, our time is getting a little short here, and we need to wind this up. So let me ask each of you to comment on the short run for a moment. Fred Smith, what's the next step? What's the first thing?
Well, I think the thing is to strip away the cover story of government's broadened definition of rights. See who's really being taken to the cleaners as we broaden this concept of right. Who is losing and who is allegedly being helped, and how much are they being helped? If you weaken that cover story and get to the truth of what's really going on in this broadening of rights, the American people will demand that the only real meaning of rights, the rights for themselves to own property and to live their own lives, are restored.
Tom?
I think that what we should do is to get back, first of all, to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, rather than these more recent civil rights bills and so on that are being debated, which the idea, at least behind the 64 Civil Rights Act, was that all people have the same rights, that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race. What we're now moving to is an era of group entitlement, where people feel, which essentially grant additional power to government to rectify what they believe to be disparate impact, wrong proportions of people in different jobs, and this is just going to create absolute havoc.
And Ron Paul, your turn.
I think it's an educational problem. Until we get the American people to understand that there are problems in definitions, and certainly in this area of rights, we can't solve our problems. I think it's important for us as Americans not to accept blindly this idea of majority vote. What we have done is we have made rights relative. We're saying that if 51% vote a certain way, that they can destroy the rights of the minority, which I think is wrong and incorrect in what we're doing. Rights are absolute. They belong to the individual. They're inherent to us naturally. They're God-given, and the government should be there to protect them, not there to abuse them. Today, we have a government that is literally abusing and destroying those rights, and it's very important that we come up with a clear understanding of this definition.
Well, that's where we'll have to leave it. I want to thank our panelists for being with us today, and thank you for watching. We'll be back next week with another vital topic at issue. The National Endowment for Liberty would like to acknowledge the inspirational contribution of Ed and Alicia Clark and the sponsors of At Issue, whose generous support makes these programs possible.